That's a little longer scripture reading than sometimes, huh? Did a great job. Well, Ed, I'm glad you didn't use the time for giving to say, oh, you want heat? Gonna have to fork it over. I think there are 4 or 5 different heaters in this place, and once the right one was found, the heat is back on. But I appreciate everybody scrambling to figure out where the problem was and figure out how the heat rises and open those back doors and get some moving in here. Thank God for that. So today we return to our sermon series, Counterfeit Gods, defeating the idols that battle for our hearts. We took a break from the series last week to talk about being thankful. But in this series, we've been learning that literally anything in life, including good things, can become an idol. If we allow that thing to take the place in our life that only God should take, it has become our idol. So far in our series, we've explored the God of food. We've explored the God of sex. We've explored the God of entertainment and the God of success. And today we're going to explore the God of money. You know, our relationship with money begins at a very early age as we watch our parents learn about the pull and the power of money. One day a man came home to his wife and 3-year-old daughter after a hard day at work. And he said to his little daughter, "Do you have a kiss for your daddy?" And she abruptly said, "No." He said, "Oh, honey, I'm hurt by your response. Daddy works so hard all day long to bring you home money, and this is how you treat me? Come now, where's my kiss?" She looked at her daddy and said, "Come now, where's my money?" Another girl wanted to help her mother at the bank ATM. So mom instructed her which buttons to push. And when the money came out, the girls screeched, "We won!" How true it is, the God of money wants us to think that winning means more money. The God of money wants us to think that the more money we have, the happier we'll be, that the better our lives will be. Kyle Idleman in his book said, "Sometimes we hear rich people say things like, 'Money doesn't make you happy.' Most of us think they all flew first class to some exotic destination and got together and agreed to say that so that the rest of us would feel better. But the truth is, having a lot of money doesn't necessarily lead to happiness, does it? Someone once defined money as an article which may be used as a universal passport to everywhere but heaven, and as a universal provider for everything except happiness. Back in 1999, Brad Pitt did an interview. And in that interview, he responded to people's illusion that he had the perfect life. He said, "Once you've got everything, you're left with yourself. It doesn't help you sleep any better, and you don't wake up any better because of it." Today, I want to challenge us with the need to develop the right attitude toward money and things. Billy Graham said, if a person gets his attitude toward money straight, it'll help straighten out almost every other area of his life. Now, the thought I want to challenge us with is this. The person who has God and has everything has no more than the person who has God and has nothing. I want you to think about that. Is that something we truly believe? Is that something that we're willing to work toward believing? That the person who has God and has everything has no more than the person who has God and has nothing. When God's on His rightful throne in our lives, and we're looking to God for all that we need for hope and satisfaction and for significance and security, we don't really need anything more than God. And when we have that understanding, then money and things are able to be used, and they're helpful for us and for others. Jesus, as you know, made it clear a person can't serve both God and money. When we try to serve both, we end up serving money more than we serve God. Mark Twain had an interesting statement. He said, "Some men worship rank, some worship heroes, some worship power, some worship God. And over these ideals they dispute and cannot unite, but they all worship money." That's quite an indictment. Years ago, a man named Ernest Becker wrote that our culture would replace God with sex and romance. But even earlier than that, Friedrich Nietzsche had a different theory. He wrote that with the growing absence of God in the Western culture, we would replace God with money. And I think he's right. But the scariest part about it to me is that most of us are blind to the culture of greed that we live in, and blind to the grip of greed that often has a hold of us. See, the human heart seeks to justify itself. And when it comes to money and greed, the God of money is a master at deception. When we compare our financial standing to others, we often compare it to those who have more than us, right? Rather than those who have less. So we tend to justify ourselves saying, well, at least I don't live as high as he does or she does or they do. You know, my lifestyle is modest compared to theirs. I don't have a problem with greed. And as a result, most Americans think of themselves as middle class. Only 2% call themselves upper class. The biblical writers, especially Jesus, had a lot to say about money. Philip Yancey identified over 450 different biblical passages that deal with handling money. And the issue of money forms the second most dominant motif in Scripture, second only to idolatry. Isn't that interesting? Of the 38 parables Jesus told, 16 of them deal with money. Jesus warns people far more about greed than he does about sex. And yet most everyone thinks they don't have a problem with greed. So I want to encourage each of us to begin with the working hypothesis that greed could easily be a problem for us. Let's just start there. Rather than, I don't have a problem with it, let's start with, there's a good chance that I also have a problem with greed. Because it hides itself so deeply and successfully, we may not even realize that we have a problem with it. Now, the problem isn't money itself, right? Money is not good or bad in and of itself. The problem is when we love money. And that's what Paul said when he wrote in 1 Timothy 6:10, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." I want us to look at two people in the Bible who loved money and who were worshiping the God of money. And the first biblical person I want us to learn from is a man whom the Bible doesn't even name by name. But his story is found there in Luke chapter 12. So one day, Jesus was teaching a crowd of listeners, and a man in the crowd spoke up and said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, it's likely this man was the younger of the two brothers, because according to the Levitical law and in that kind of society, the majority of the estate went to the oldest son. And so this guy's probably a younger son. And he wants Jesus to do something, right? Of course, Jesus said, "Man, who made me a judge or arbiter between you?" He was wise enough to know not to stick his nose into somebody else's business where it probably wasn't welcome, right? But Jesus used this teachable moment to teach everyone present about the danger of serving the God of money. So he said to the crowd in verse 15, "Take care. Be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And then Jesus went on to tell a story, right? The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you've prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So this story obviously describes someone who's worshiping the God of money. And if you look closely at the story, you'll notice the man refers to himself 9 times in 2 verses. Me, my. We see no acknowledgement from this man that what he has come from God. Nor is there ever a thought in his mind, why don't I share what I have with others? The primary key to keeping money in its rightful place is to remember that it all belongs to God. Whatever we have is on loan from God. Psalm 24:1 clearly states it. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The Contemporary English Version puts it, the earth and everything on it, including its people, belong to the Lord. The world and its people belong to Him. Kyle Eidelman, in his chapter on the subject, encourages us to think about that God is the owner of everything. And he suggests that we might start a day and walk through the whole day thinking about how that everything is God's. He says it like this: go through your day sometime just recognizing everything is God's. Get out of God's bed and walk into God's bathroom and turn on God's shower and put on God's clothes. Eat God's cereal, which he suggests are Frosted Flakes. You might suggest something else. Drink God's coffee, which you might think is Dunkin' or maybe Starbucks. I don't know which is his favorite. Get in God's car, head to work. When we start to see all our resources as God's, helps us develop an attitude of gratitude. It's not ours. It's all God's. He's just given it to us on loan. And we need to be good stewards and use it for His glory, right? So, consider for a minute how the man in the story Jesus told was looking to money to do for him the very things that only God should do for us. And again, this is the definition of something becoming an idol, when it takes the place that belongs to God. First, the man looked to money as his source of security. He told himself he had plenty of good things laid up for many years. And is that something that you and I try to do? Accumulate enough where we feel like we're set, where we don't have any worries? When we look to money as security, it has become our God. Secondly, he looked to money as a source of satisfaction. He thought to himself he'd accumulated all this, and it was all for his enjoyment. Now he could just eat, drink, and be merry. His satisfaction didn't come from the thought of, I'm living a life that's pleasing to God. It didn't come from the thought of, I have such good and healthy relationships with my family or my brothers and sisters or my neighbor. All he thought about was his relationship to money and how it brought him satisfaction. And then finally, he looked to money for his source of significance, right? His focus was on himself, how much more he could accumulate. And the more he accumulated, the more significant he was. Everyone would envy him and respect him because he had much bigger barns than they did. The God of money wants us to believe that our significance comes from what we make of ourselves, that our self-worth is a product of our net worth. The man in Luke 12 had put his trust in money and possessions. His plan was to retire early, eat, drink, and be merry. But that's not what happened to him. You know in the story. God called him a fool and took his life from him that very night. The man learned the folly of allowing the God of money to lead him to store up treasures for himself and not be rich toward God. It's about as foolish a mistake as any of us could make. The second biblical person I want us to talk about is Zacchaeus. And most of you are familiar with the story of Zacchaeus from Luke chapter 19. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. He lived there in Jericho. And just like most people in our day don't like people who work for the IRS, people in his day didn't like people who worked for the Romans as their tax collectors. He was a Jewish man who had sold himself out to the Romans, and he was shunned by the Jewish community because of that. So why would someone take a job as a Roman tax collector? Why would a man betray his people and live as a pariah on his own society? Why would someone do that? The answer is money. Now, when Zacchaeus heard Jesus was coming through town, he did an unusual thing. He climbed a tree to be able to get a good look at Jesus. Like me, Zacchaeus was a little vertically challenged. He was a shorter man, right? He couldn't see because of the crowd, and obviously no one was going to let Zacchaeus have the best place, right? They all pushed him to the back. They weren't going to give up their place for a guy like him. And in traditional cultures where honor and dignity were prized, no man would climb a tree for any reason. That would be something people would ridicule. But Zacchaeus' willingness to climb the tree signifies his desperation. He had more money than he could spend, but he knew something was missing from his life. And maybe Jesus had the thing that he needed. And so, to the great surprise of everyone, including Zacchaeus, Jesus called him by name and invited himself to eat with Zacchaeus in Zacchaeus' house. So when Zacchaeus saw Jesus had chosen him, the least virtuous of all the people in the crowd, for a personal relationship, his whole spiritual understanding began to change. He wanted to become a follower of Jesus, but he immediately realized if he was going to do that, his relationship with money had to change. And so there in his home, in front of Jesus and his guests, he made the declaration, "Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will restore it fourfold." How's that for breaking the chains of bondage that the God of money had him trapped in for years? He promised to give away 50% of his wealth to the poor. He promised to pay people for the ways he had cheated them. He knew how much he'd amassed over the years by cheating people. Can you imagine the line of people who would line up there to get repayment? He wasn't going to just give them their money back, penny for penny. He was going to give them back 4 times the amount of what he'd stolen from them. What had brought about this amazing transformation? When Jesus came into Zacchaeus' life, he realized that although he was financially rich, he was spiritually bankrupt. But by grace, God was willing to make him spiritually rich. And in that moment, he removed the God of money from the throne of his life and replaced it with Jesus, the God of mercy. And what Jesus did for Zacchaeus, He can do for each one of us. He can help us stop serving the God of money, but we have to make that first step. We have to initiate the change. We don't have to end up like the rich fool of Luke 12. Like Zacchaeus, we can wake up to our wrong relationship with money before it's too late. To help us do that, though, let's ask some questions for introspection. We've done that with each of these idols. Just some questions to get us thinking about our relationship with these things. And the first question is, how often do you compare what you have and what you make to others? See, our world and the God of money encourage us to measure our life and our worth by our possessions and our money. We must resist that temptation. Jesus, of course, reminds us that a person's life does not consist of the abundance of their possessions. Life's much more big and important than that. Question number 2, how much anxiety do finances add to your life? Now, we may regularly face financial difficulties, but what do we do when we face those difficulties? Does worry take over? Do we try to handle it all ourselves? Or do we look to God for help? Do we trust in God? Question number 3, to what extent are your dreams and goals driven by money? And what do you tell yourself will happen if you just hit the lottery? Or end up having a relative you never knew who was rich die and leave you everything, right? Do you dream about that kind of thing and what you would do? How might you feel differently about yourself if you had more money? And if you had more money, are you more likely to spend it on yourself? What would you do with it? And then the final question is, what is your attitude toward giving? What percentage of your income are you regularly giving to God and to other good works? See, if we're not faithful with what we have, even though it may be little, how will we ever be faithful if we had more? And the best way to keep money from controlling us is to give it away. And as we've done with each of these, Kyle Idleman has a small devotional piece that I've shared with you, and it's in your handout as well. Jesus, my provider. The God of money was almost irresistible. He had spun tales of sports cars and luxury homes and all the good things He was going to buy for us. Yes, he had heard the old refrain that money can't buy happiness. We knew that. We'd seen what it had done to people over and over again, but we were going to be different. We would know how to use money without letting it use us. We didn't want to buy happiness. We just wanted to rent a little pleasure. But somewhere it all went wrong. Somehow the God of money became a slave driver. He kept us running, following Him, trying to keep Him from getting away. We followed the green brick road until we longed for rest. We put our hope in what we might find at the end of the rainbow. We thought money would provide us with security and significance and some measure of satisfaction, but strangely, even when we had money, we still felt broke. Then we chose Jesus and discovered that He is our provider. He provides everything we need. He provides us with security because He never leaves us or forsakes us. He provides us with significance because our identity and value are found in His love. And He provides us with satisfaction because our souls were made for Him. We discovered that God would meet all our needs according to the riches of His glory in Christ Jesus. Since it's December, Christmas is near, I thought it might be good to end with Charles Dickens' classic story, A Christmas Carol. And again, the computer doesn't want to show us this nice picture. That's okay. This is a great illustration because it is what we've been talking about, right? So the story's main character is that mean and intimidating Ebenezer Scrooge who lives to make money and little else. Ebenezer Scrooge has no use for religion or sentimentality until one Christmas Eve, right? When he gets this terrifying wake-up call. The spirit of his deceased business partner, Jacob Marley, who died 7 Christmases ago and was a miser just like Scrooge, came to visit Scrooge, bound and wrapped in some terrible chains. Jacob Marley had been condemned to roam the face of the earth, tormented in death by the things he neglected to value in life. Marley was desperate to give his old colleague a final chance to avoid the same fate as his. And he made it clear that this was Scrooge's last opportunity to turn from his selfish ways. He explained that 3 more spirits would visit Scrooge, the spirits of Christmas past and Christmas present and Christmas future. So when the clock struck 1 a.m. that night, the spirit of Christmas past arrived and took Scrooge on an unforgettable trip down memory lane to visit his own childhood. And the spirit took him to a schoolroom. And there they see a lonely boy sitting with his only friend, the book that he was reading. Scrooge remembered his loneliness, how he longed for the presence of friends. He recalled his past desires for love and approval of his family, but then he saw all the people who tried to reach out to him, who tried to stop his slide into self-absorption. He saw his former fiancée, who came in a poor second to Scrooge's passion for wealth. And she complained to him from the past, "A golden idol displaces me. All hopes have merged into a master passion. The thought of money engrosses you." And if Scrooge had been shaken by the visit of the first spirit, the second was no less disturbing. The spirit of Christmas present arrived to take him on a tour of the people he now knew. He found himself standing in the home of his poor clerk, Bob Cratchit, where he felt the warmth of a large and friendly family who were making the best with what little Scrooge paid him. Scrooge experienced their anxiety over the fate of Tiny Tim, their youngest son, who was ill. And he was clearly shown the effects of his own selfish nature. But the Spirit helped him understand that even though he was utterly hard-hearted, others hadn't given up on him. And as the Cratchits sat down to their feeble Christmas dinner, Bob Cratchit thinks to toast to his boss, Ebenezer Scrooge, against the protests from his wife. And Tiny Tim answers the toast with one of his own: "God bless us and everyone." And the final spirit, the spirit of Christmas future, arrived. It had no face and did not speak. It merely pointed. And Scrooge looked to where the spirit was pointing. And again he saw the Cratchit family, worn down by their struggle against poverty. And now without Tiny Tim, whose lonely crutch stood unused in the corner. And the spirit took Scrooge to visit the house of a man who died in his sleep. And a maid and a cleaner were taking and dividing his possessions before the undertaker arrived. 2 associates out in the street were discussing whether it was even necessary to hold a funeral service, for surely no one would come. Scrooge asked, "Who is this man?" And the Spirit led him to a grave whose headstone bore the name Ebenezer Scrooge, died 1843, and no other words adorned the grave marker. And the 2 grave diggers leave his open grave to visit the local pub. Scrooge had lived long enough to make it miserable for everyone. Thankfully for Scrooge, he recognized this was his life-changing moment. It was now or never. And he asked whether it's possible to mend his ways and alter his life and destiny. Surely the spirits wouldn't be visiting him if it were not. And as Christmas morning dawned and he awoke once more to the world, he realized He'd been given a reprieve, a second chance. Dickens believed that we have all been given a second chance. Because of the birth of Jesus, the true hero of the greatest Christmas story. And at the heart of the Christmas carol lies Scrooge's transformation. He changes from a selfish, greedy, bitter old man into a grateful, generous, compassionate person. He stopped serving the god of money and began to use money to bless others. He was a man who saw his life transformed to the point where Dickens concludes at the end of the book, he became as good a friend, as good a master, as good a man as the good old city knew. So, when you look at your life and I look at mine, do we see too much Scrooge living in there? Maybe like Scrooge, we too are living too selfishly, too greedily. Maybe like Scrooge, we too are just not valuing people as we should. Maybe like Scrooge, we too need a Christmas Eve conversion. And if we turn to God, and if we submit ourselves to God, and put God in His rightful place, He can make the changes in our life that need to be changed. We don't have to end up like the rich fool. We can follow the example of Zacchaeus or Ebenezer Scrooge and overcome the lure and the trap of the god of money.